Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Amy, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you're all able to attend today. What we're going to go through, if you've ever attended these dyslexia workshops before, is just update you on all the new research. But we start with how the brain reads and what we know about that from neuroscience, and that is exploding. Neuroscience is exploding, and you're going to be amazed at all the new research that I'll be able to share with you on how the brain reads, and it's much more complex than we ever thought, by the way. Then we're going to go into dyslexia research, the historical perspective. Then we're going to look at what's considered, it used to be called the multi-deficit approach, but we don't speak about dyslexia anymore in terms of deficits. We talk in terms of challenges and strengths. And so it's now considered a multi-factor approach. What are all the underlying issues that can contribute to a child having trouble learning to read? And we'll talk about the strengths that have now been identified in students who have been diagnosed with dyslexia, but in students who are struggling readers as well. Then we'll look at the underlying factors that are very important for reading, writing, and spelling, and finish up with best practices and interventions. So with that, let's just start with some of the newer science. You can see this just came out this year. This is actually fMRI slides accumulated over time. The ones on the left where it says neurosynth, the neurosynth approach is one where what you're doing is actually, you're actually looking at a synthesis of thousands and thousands of children when they're and adults. This is actually adults when they're talking, and then you're synthesizing that. The manifold approach, manifold is just multiple views in a way, but it's also mathematical. So the manifold approach uses a mathematical formula and mathematical formulas to determine the parts of the brain that are connected and active when we talk. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is what you can see is when you're talking, when you're using language, a good part of your left hemisphere lights up, but you'll notice very little of the right hemisphere, and very little of it cuts over even into the medial views of the brain. But when someone is a reader and a proficient reader, what you see is almost the whole brain light up. You see a lot of activation of the left hemisphere, and just to show you much more than just what around the ear here that we see with speech, but almost the entire left hemisphere, whether you're looking at the neurosynth approach or the manifold approach. What you see in the middle is the combination of the two. And you just see that reading activates the whole brain. Now, the reason this is important is that reading is much more complex than we thought for many years, and we're starting to really understand that. So this is from Stanislas Dehaene's book on reading in the brain. I love this image because it shows the different areas of the brain important. What you see with red are just regions important for handwriting, for example, in the frontal parietal lobe, attention and eye movements in the back of the brain, that red oval. If you look down at the visual cortex down at the bottom, the occipital lobe, you can see what's called the visual word form area. And then you see all these red lines. And what those red lines are is linking these language areas that you saw on this slide to vision. And once you do that, once you coordinate vision and sound in the brain, you create a whole new brain. But for some students, that becomes difficult. The reason I emphasize this, and I don't spend too much time on it, is some of us think of reading as especially learning to read as almost entrenched with phonological awareness and decoding, which are very important, being able to parse a word into sounds. But unless you can link those sounds to letters, then what happens is you're still struggling with reading. So the visual component of reading is as important as the auditory and the linking of the two. So just to illustrate this, if you're looking at an object, no matter how you're looking at it, and this is just a silhouette of a horse, you can tell, but it can be upside down, it can be backwards, it's still a horse. But when you're looking at letters, the orientation of the circle and the line is critical. And it's not just, is the circle on the left or right? Is it high? Is it low? Where is it? And even if you look at the words below, it's very easy to misread a word and to look at Google. I just took the Google icon there, and what I did is just changed it and put two G's in, so it's goggle, or two B's, so it's gobble. But I'll bet all of you at first just thought it was Google 3 times, because we're so used to the icon and we're so used to words. That word that starts with a G has an O in it and an LE. And so reading is much more complex than we understood for many years. What you're looking at here are some of the key areas of the brain that have to be active and mature and ready for instruction when a child gets to school. And what we're going to talk about is some students have environmental issues, so that they haven't been exposed to a lot of books. They haven't been exposed to the written letters of pages. And as a result, when they get to school, their visual word form area, that C area, is not going to be as developed as a student who's been read to for 4 years before they enter school. And all of these parts of the brain have to be linked together. And each one has a different job. So you can see here the arrows that show that A, for example, is very important for phonological representation and for just being able to phonological awareness, being able to hear the sounds and parse words into sound. But we also need to map the sound to the letter, which you all know, and that's what C is all about. And we have to be able to link the letters and the words to meaning. And we have to understand prefixes and suffixes. That's over on the left. That's morphological awareness. And all of these parts of the brain, to do that, have to be linked together. So it's one thing to have the parts of the brain mature and ready to learn. It's another thing to have them coordinated and working well together. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. Now, the historical view of dyslexia, just as a reminder, is that it comes from the Greek word dys, meaning abnormal or difficult, and the word lexis, which in Greek is the word. We interpret that as reading. So it would be problem with words if you were interpreting it literally. Now, it came from working with adults who'd had strokes or brain injuries who couldn't work and who couldn't read. And the term that's used if someone has lost their ability to read, if they had the ability to read and then lost it because of a brain injury, is called alexia, because the morpheme in Greek says without. So without words would be alexia. Dyslexia just means words are hard. And the way that we have traditionally for many years diagnosed students who have dyslexia is what has been called the discrepancy criteria, which means that a school or an evaluator looks at a student's potential, often using IQ, often using performance IQ, for example, and they say, okay, is there a gap? Is the reading further behind than we would expect based on this student's potential? So that's often used in school districts, although different districts have different criteria, different special services individuals use different tests and different criteria. So what I like to do is just to say, look, students who struggle to read, not all are diagnosed with dyslexia, but they all are students we want to understand and we want to intervene with, and we want to get up to par so that they can be effective readers and learn from reading. And to do that, what we have to do is start to identify these children when they're young. And we have a lot of research along these lines. Nadine Gabb and others have really worked hard on identifying factors that would be critical and possibly indicate that a student's going to have trouble learning to read. Certainly one that we know well and that we've talked about for a long time is the ability to parse words into sounds, the ability to hear the word book and know it has a b and an and a k, and to hear those components. And then to link those, be able to rhyme words, to be able to figure out two words that start with the same sound or end with the same sound. We also know that some students have trouble learning to recognize the sound and the symbol together. So they might know an A is an A, but they have trouble linking A to ah, for example, or ah. Some students have trouble learning the alphabet in the beginning. And sometimes what that means is a student has a little bit of trouble with what we call auditory working memory, that they just have trouble memorizing things like alphabet, letter names, or numbers sometimes as well, numerals. As the students get older, we see problems learning how to decode sometimes. We will also see very frequently students have problems naming quickly. If you say name as many animals as you can in the next minute, students may struggle and only be able to get one or two names out. And they also have trouble going the other way and being able to figure out, okay, I want to write the word book. What letters would I use to do that? And that's referred to encoding. What this eventually leads to, though, those are the problems that we see when students are learning to read, and sometimes before they're learning to read, even when they're learning the alphabet, for example, or they're learning to rhyme. But once they have gone through the learning process, what we see as the students get older, as they get into middle school and high school, what we see is problems with reading fluency. They read very slowly and laboriously. Reading comprehension as a result tends to be reduced because it's very hard to comprehend what you're reading if you're going reading comprehension. It's too slow. It puts too much of a burden on your memory system. And so what happens is these students don't read for fun because it's a struggle, but they also have trouble retaining and understanding what they've read. Often they also have a reduced written language vocabulary, so they can identify some words, but they have trouble identifying other words. And this oftentimes affects sight words, for example, where they misread a sight word, or where sometimes they'll read horse as house, and they just have trouble distinguishing words easily and quickly. That all lowers their content knowledge. So if you have somebody in the fourth grade or the fifth grade that's supposed to be reading to learn, they have a science book, they have a social studies book, they have math word problems, those students are really struggling with that because they are reading so slowly and laboriously that it's hard to utilize that reading either to learn other things or to solve problems, for example, in math. And what that ultimately leads to is a decline in overall school performance because so many subject areas depend on reading. So this multi-factor view says, okay, let's look at what are the factors that can contribute to a student having trouble learning to read or having trouble reading proficiently as they get older. And what has been identified and supported by years of research at this point in time is these four major factors. The first one is environment. As I mentioned before, you have some students who may not have had a lot of access to books for lots of reasons, especially during COVID the last 2.5 years. If I have a 4-year-old, that 4-year-old may not have had the opportunity just to be exposed to books and text the way some other students had. Sometimes it's environmental. Sometimes parents have other priorities. They're working 2 jobs and they don't have time to sit and read to their students. Then you have perceptual and cognitive level issues. Some students just speech sounds a little muddy to them, or they have a heavy dialect, or their first language isn't English. And so when they're listening to language, it doesn't sound as clear. If you've ever been in another country and you know the language, but you're trying to figure out what they're saying, you know it isn't clear. And what you want them to do is slow down. Then there are differences in the brain. We all have differences in the brain. We all have strengths and weaknesses. I often give the example, I am a klutz and I married a pro basketball player. And the result was that if I had been in basketball world, I would have been diagnosed as having a learning issue, and people would have struggled with me, and I would have had PT and OT. But the bottom line is, what we call an issue is kind of open question. We just all have different brains, and our different brains are good at some things and not good at other things. And for some students, perceiving speech sounds or this working memory, being able to hold auditory symbols in mind, can be very difficult. And then finally, there are genetic differences. Very often when you have a student who's having a little trouble reading and you talk to a parent, they'll say, well, his brother had trouble reading too. Or sometimes a parent will say, well, I had trouble, or my brother had trouble, or my sister had trouble. So it does run in families. But that doesn't mean that that's going to be the only factor and that the student can't learn to read. We know now that genetic factors are not a be all and end all. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. So the risk factors are genetic, brain level differences, perceptual and cognitive level differences, and then as well as environmental factors. And with COVID, we have a lot of students who just have had 2 years of non-optimal, let's say, exposure to literature, to books, to teaching. And that's going to affect a lot of students. I like to use this as an illustration. I like to use this iceberg because we all understand that an iceberg has a little part above the water that you can see, and then a huge component under the water. And of course, that's what sunk the Titanic. But the reason I like to say this is, for years when we looked at students with reading problems, we just looked at what we could see on the surface. Do they have problems parsing words into sound? Do they have problems decoding? Do they have problems with the alphabet? Do they have problems naming quickly? And those are important variables, and we want to look at those. But underneath are these others. Underneath are genetic factors, brain level differences, environmental factors, and differences in perception and cognition that, when you combine those, can really affect what the student is able to do in terms of reading and how they learn. Now, this is a relatively complex graph. It's an adaptation of a figure that Logan DeLay and I developed for an article that's going to come out in the journal CPQ Neurology this month. But what the point of this is that the brain changes all the time. Your brain is changing no matter how old you are. My brain is still changing, and I'm getting up there. It changes by every exposure we have and by any new thing we learn. And that maturation is profound from 2 to 24 years of age. And so, because the brain has changed, what you see in the triangle right under the big yellow box that says brain development is those community factors, adversity in the home, or social deprivation because of COVID, or disadvantages from one neighborhood to another in terms of resources or in terms of access to the internet. And then you have over on the right 2 ovals, and one says cognitive domain and the other says emotional domain. And what we understand about all of these factors is that in the cognitive domain, all of us have differences in our memory skills, our working memory skills. Some of you remember things really well if you see them. Others remember things really well if you hear them. Others, like me, have to write them down. And people know, if they are in a meeting with me, that I'm avidly taking notes all the time, because that's what helps me remember what we're doing. We also have differences in attention. Some of us can attend and focus very well to what we hear. Again, others need to attend to what we see. Others need multi-presentation approaches to grab our attention. And those components all contribute to reading and to how easy it is for a student to read. If they have a good visual working memory, good auditory working memory, reading is a lot better than if they have manual skills, for example. They might be a great athlete, but it might be hard for them to learn to read. And then over on the right, you have the emotional and social components to just education in general, but does the student feel supported? Do they have confidence that they can learn? Can they take the perspective of others? What are their social skills? And do they have access to resources and to physical exercise? And at the top, what you see are the educational initiatives that we use, the what of teaching, to help all students learn to be effective in all of the subject areas. And on the right, you have remediation that we can use to target specific needs of every individual. So why does this matter? Because young students all the way up through adolescence. Remember, that chart goes 2 to 24 years of age, that students all the way from 2 years of age all the way through high school have brains that are changing constantly, and they're changing based on effective educational initiatives and timely interventions if they're necessary. And what that means is that education is what changes brains, and you're going to see more of that as we get into it in just a minute. But the problem is, if all we deal with is what we can see, oh, this student's having trouble learning the alphabet, let's just spend another 5 hours every day working on the alphabet. If we work with a student just on what we can see and we don't consider these other factors, then if you have somebody like me who's a klutz and you don't work on my coordination and my speed and my agility, I'm never going to be a good athlete. But I've got to work on those foundational skills. And that's what we need to work on with our students as well. So I have a little poll question here. If the chat is working, you can answer it in the chat, or you can just keep it in your mind. And at the end, we'll discuss it a little bit more. But considering the dyslexia iceberg that you saw, why is it important to consider reading issues that aren't readily observable? Is it because the deep view helps clarify the variables that lead to problems learning to read? Is it because some of the factors like perceptual or cognitive level differences or environmental issues can be changed? Is it because the human brain changes all the time? So brain level differences are just as amenable to change through effective instruction and remediation as any other skills. Or is it all of the above? And Sharon, raise your hand, and I'll get to you, Sharon, at the end. So keep your thought in mind. We'll leave some time for questions, and we'll make sure we get there. Okay, now what about the genetic factors? Yes, developmental dyslexia is heritable. We know that 50% of children who are diagnosed with dyslexia do have a sister or a brother or a mother or a father who have received that diagnosis or who consider themselves struggling readers. 68% of identical twins, that's over 2/3 of identical twins. If one twin is diagnosed with dyslexia, the other will. But again, I want to remind you that understanding what challenges different genes affect are what we're looking at. It's not that, oh, well, I've got this gene, therefore I'm never going to be good at this. It's okay, I've got this gene, and so I've got a risk. And I like to give the example of smoking, for example. If you had a parent who had lung cancer, what you probably wouldn't want to do is smoke, because you know you've got a gene that predisposes you to having effects from cigarettes. But dyslexia genes, there are so many of them, and they are so variable. Understanding them and what component they play is where we want to go, so we know how to individualize our interventions for students. Now, this is just one example of a excellent study that was published relatively recently, showing that often when students have genes that predispose them to dyslexia, some of the genes, they also have trouble learning language. They have trouble learning words. They're often slow in the development of language. And that in and of itself can signal, if I have a student who, when they were 2 or 3, started talking late, maybe I want to spend a little extra time with that student before we start working on reading to see if there are some interventions we can do to tackle these phonological issues that may be a factor. Now, brain level differences, we now know are there. We can see them. You're going to see a really complex slide about that in just a minute. But in the beginning, what we looked at was places, and that was that kind of first slide you saw. So we know that some students, this part of the left hemisphere that's right in front of your ear, it's called the inferior frontal cortex, sometimes isn't as mature. And those students might have a speech problem. They might be a little difficult to understand when they're young. They might have problems thinking of words quickly. Then we also know that we can have students who have problems in the occipital lobe here, the screen area, this circle, and they may have trouble with what I was talking about earlier, recognizing letters, recognizing being able to distinguish between a B and a P and a D and a Q, and knowing how to orient letters and then linking them to sound. And then this temporal parietal cortex is very important for being able to parse words into sound and link those sounds to letters. But it's not just regions. I mean, it would be like saying, well, if you're from Cincinnati, you have this, and if you're from Chicago, you have that, and if you're from Los Angeles, you have this, and if you're from Ireland, you have that. And that's not how it works, because in the brain, there's a huge highway system that links these together, so they work together. Reading involves this linking of all these areas together. And so we've known also for several years, and you can see this is Gabriele's lab, since 2018 or longer, we've known that there are these fiber tracts that develop when you learn to read and when you learn language. And they mature, they get thicker and they get faster and more efficient as a child matures. And we can look at the thickness of them, or something called the fractional anisotropy. That's a long word, but they abbreviate it as FA. We can look at that and we can see, oh, this fiber tract isn't quite as mature. So think of it as a 4-lane highway versus a 2-lane highway. If you have a 2-lane highway and you're trying to get through the city of Chicago, it's going to take a long time, right, to link the north suburbs to the south suburbs. But if you have a 6-lane highway or an 8-lane highway, it's going to go faster. And so that's what we look at with the fiber tracts. And one of the first fiber tracts that was identified to distinguish some students who have trouble learning to read was a fiber tract that links the listening part of your thalamus. Thalamus is a real deep structure in your brain. It's the gateway to the brain. And that gateway will take information that comes in from the environment and channel it to certain parts of the brain. And that particular gateway, this is called the medial geniculate body, handles very rapidly occurring sounds, and speech is very rapid. A typical consonant is 20 thousandths of a second or 40 thousandths of a second long. That's really, really short. And so this is a fiber tract that when it's big and strong, the students can handle speech. They can hear all the sounds. But if it's not well developed, oftentimes their perception of rapidly occurring sounds is hard. So the word like boo, 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 moo, they all sound the same to them because they can't distinguish those sounds. And that makes it hard to link a letter to a sound. And this is some newer research. You can see this just came out this year, looking at some other major fiber tracts that have to be developed. The superior longitudinal fasciculus, it's a long word. It just means the top long fiber tract. That's all that means, is much more mature in students who read easily and are able to learn to read easily on a test called the Tower. And then we also have parts of the brain that are very important for motor coordination that mature when you read, probably because of the eye movements and the importance of linking sound to vision. But this is where I want to really focus. This is a brand new article that just came out a few months ago, looking at typical readers. That's the top row, if you will. And you can see I put an arrow and a circle around typical readers versus readers who've been diagnosed with dyslexia. And you're looking at 3 different measures. The upper left, is change with reading development. And this just shows you how complex this ability to read is and how many of these areas are building as students are in school learning to read. This is the power of a teacher and a good reading teacher. And so what you see is reading development, a lot of left hemisphere and then a lot of right hemisphere areas. Now, the second one, B, is correlation with reading progress. And this is a little different. It's a correlation. So students who are good readers, as they get better and better and better, what parts of their brain are really building? And what I want to emphasize here are these red lines, because those are the fiber tracks. And what you see is these highways developing more and more lanes so that the students can easily link all these different parts of the brain together to be able to read effectively. And notice that when you have students who are dyslexic, this second row, they don't have near the complexity in the brain maturation. It just, those areas aren't building. So in a way, you could think of the students at the top as having big cities with lots of roads that link one suburb to the other, and the student on the bottom has only a couple small towns and not very many roads, and so takes longer to get around and it's harder to get around. And then what we have in C is how we can predict whether an intervention is going to really be successful. And I want to emphasize that because the interventions that work on these fiber tracks and work on building these areas are the interventions that are going to really be helpful. And they're not just a simple, let's just do this kind of activity like decode. You have to get lots of visual, memory, attentional, cognitive skills that you're working on, as well as the reading skills. And then there's also something called asymmetries, and this is relatively new research, although we've looked at asymmetries a long time. Some of you may be left-handed. Almost all of us are right-handed, and you see me gesturing with my right hand. And if you're right-handed, most of your language skills and your beginning reading skills are in the left hemisphere. But what we've learned is left-handers have a little different organization, and children who have problems with reading often also have a different organization. And some of these key areas are in the other hemisphere. Now, what does that mean? What it means is you have to have whole new highways that are linking those areas, and those highways are going to be different. They're going to be longer, and they're going to be more complex highways for students where the brain organization is a little different. It doesn't mean the brain isn't as good. It just means it's a city that has lots more suburbs, and the suburbs are more diverse, and you got to build the highways for that. So in summary, what we have is that there are a lot of individual differences. Some students who struggle with reading have visual problems. Some students who struggle with reading have auditory perceptual issues. Some have cognitive, some have a combination. But when we're looking at asymmetry, it's only in the very beginning that it matters. The asymmetry, the left hemisphere may not have as much activation when the student is learning to read, but the brain changes. And when we work on phonological decoding and when we work on reading skills with that student in a very strategic, very individualized way, we can change the symmetry of the brain and make the brain more efficient. So the conclusion is that we have nature and nurture. And if you saw the article on dyslexia in the blog post, you saw some of this. But nature is what we're born with. And some of us are really good at art, and some of us are really good at music, and some of us are naturally good at sports and can catch balls and throw balls, and some of us are naturally good at learning to read. But that doesn't mean that you won't be a great reader, because the human brain can and does change. And that's the nurture part. And what we need is effective interventions and individualized interventions that address all the different factors that could be contributing to a reading problem. So the human brain is very complex. It isn't simple. Reading is not simple. It is not just a matter of matching a letter to a sound and learning how to decode. We've got to consider the complexity of the human brain, and we have to consider the strengths and challenges of every student we work with. Each student is different. Each student's brain is different. Some have perceptual strengths. Some have challenges. Some might be really good auditorily. They perceive acutely, but they have trouble when it's presented visually. They have trouble with letters. They have trouble matching the letters. They confuse the B and the P and the Q and the D. And other students, the vision is fine. The letters they've got, but they have trouble perceiving the sounds. They just have trouble linking to the letter because it doesn't sound clear to them. And others have sensory motor issues. They might have trouble with just visual tracking from left to right, or handwriting, or other challenges. Some students have verbal skills and good phonological skills, and other students have lots of nonverbal skills. They can read you really well. They know what you're thinking, but they're not so good at listening to everything that you say. There are also cognitive strengths and challenges. As I've said before, some of us remember things well when we see it. Some things remember a little bit better when we hear it. And it doesn't mean that you're an auditory learner. For example, I'm very good, but I've worked with speech and language for a long time. I'm very good at listening. But I do better if I can see it as well as listen to it. So it's not like, oh, she's an auditory learner and he's a visual learner. We all have different combinations, and some things we might learn well one way and some things we might learn well another way. And that affects our attention, and it affects our memory, and it affects our reasoning. We attend to things that are easy for us to grasp, and we tend to tune out if it's too complex or if it doesn't seem easy. Students who have trouble learning to read are not going to sit down and for enjoyment read the back of their cereal box. They're going to do something else. And then we all have strengths and challenges in language. Some of us find language a lot more fun and interesting, and we love to play with words, do Wordle every morning. And others don't want to do Wordle. They want to do Sudoku because they're better with numbers. And that's just human nature. And within those strengths, some people are good with words, but they're not so good with sentences and writing sentences or reading and learning from reading. And others might be really good when you give them a book, but they don't like to do word games. And that's what we have to keep in mind, that when any individual who has any kind of a developmental difference are going to have some strengths, and they're going to also have some challenges. Now, what we've discovered with dyslexia in recent years is that often individuals diagnosed with dyslexia have some real strengths. One is discovery. They have a lot of curiosity very often, and they like to explore. And so they're good at discovering new things and seeing new things and solving problems in new ways. They're often very inventive. Some of our best inventors that have been around for years are actually not so good readers sometimes. Ted Turner, you might know, has been diagnosed with dyslexia. Leonardo da Vinci was considered dyslexic. So, and then we have creativity. Individuals who have dyslexia often are really good at solving problems new ways and looking at the world in a new way, making them very good at painting, perhaps, or some of the other creative arts. And so researchers have been investigating whether these strengths reflect underlying specializations. And what we've discovered is that, yes, they do, and there are work-related strengths. So when dyslexic adults get out in the workforce, they're often very entrepreneurial. They often run businesses like Ted Turner and are very good at running businesses and coming up with good business models. As we said, they may be very creative and have very good self-discipline and good work ethics. They might be great visual reasoning individuals skills and become artistic, for example, or they might have great practical skills, visual spatial skills, or storytelling abilities. And this is a relatively new article by Doyle that discusses all of the strengths that we're now starting to identify in individuals who struggle to learn to read. So where are we now? We've got it. What do we do about this? How do we individualize and how do we target these students effectively? And what we're learning is we're taking contributions from learning science, and this is a learning science web approach, intervention approach that we have at Carnegie Learning. But we have to look at both how students learn to read and what they learn to read, the content and the manner. And that includes the cognitive skills. This is from How We Learn by Stanislas Dehaene, a leading neuroscientist. It doesn't matter what the content is. If you're not paying attention, that's the first pillar, or you're not actively engaged. We've certainly learned that from COVID, or people don't tell you if you made a mistake, so you just keep making it over and over again, or you don't integrate and consolidate everything you've learned. Any of those hows of teaching can affect the outcome just as much as what is going on. So when you look at attention, for example, how many of you have heard, well, he just doesn't pay attention. He just isn't, I've just noticed in class, he's not paying attention. Or maybe a parent will say, well, you didn't pay attention to me when I said that. But the student does. There are other factors. Why aren't they paying attention? And what happened that interfered with their ability to pay attention? It's not that simple. But what we have learned is we can improve attentional skills, especially those skills important for phonological and auditory perceptual capacities that are very important for learning to read, being able to parse a word into sounds, through a program called the Fast Forward program. We'll talk about it more in another webinar, but just that program alone being used at the Brain Lab by Courtney Stevens with language and reading impaired students showed tremendous improvements in ability to attend to sounds and to rhyme and to decode. The other pillars include social skills, what we call SEL activities, and I've included the Castle model over there of social emotional learning capacities. But students have to be engaged. They have to be confident that they can do it and think, wow, this is fun. This is interesting. I can do this. And then once they do it, they need to have time to think about it and apply it to the rest of their world and what else they know. And finally, we know that technology can really help with this, because what digital programs can do is provide immediate feedback. Every time a student makes a response on the computer, is what sound does this word start with? Book. And they pick out a B, and they can say, yay, the computer can say, yay. A teacher can't do that for every student when they're responding on paper, pencil, or even when the teacher's teaching. So technology offers a way, when we add it to classroom instruction, that can aid both attention and working memory and strengthen retrieval and strengthen consolidation. So just to kind of take this one step further, we used to have what we called the simple view of reading. It was around for a long time. Hey, reading's not that hard. All you have to do is recognize words, decode, and then understand what the words are and know the prefixes and suffixes, and you become a skilled reader. But we now know, based on all the neuroscience, based on all the learning science, this is the Duke and Cartwright model, the active reading model, that you need cognitive skills. You need to be able to attend. That's the green circle. You've got to be able to attend and control yourself and sit still and focus on what you're doing. You've got to be able to comprehend the words. Yes, you have to be able to recognize the words, but then there are bridging processes. You've got to remember what you've read. You've got to remember what the word means. You've got to remember the difference between one word and another. And all of those are what contribute to skilled reading. So what we want with a comprehensive model is to understand that reading difficulties, have many causes. And those causes are within and go beyond word recognition and language comprehension. The competencies of any student or the challenges, the difficulties exist beyond the simple view. So word recognition and language comprehension aren't separate. There are important processes that bridge them. And most important is that this just came out yesterday, actually, on Neuroscience News. You don't read it, but I get it every day, that it starts to become reciprocal. Good reading affects your ability to listen and to learn by listening, and good listening affects your ability to read, and the two are reciprocal. So good readers are good learners. You can see it came out October 18th in Neuroscience News. But the writing system is important too, and when we learn how we learn to read and how we process speech, all are intertwined and work together. And literacy actually promotes the connectivity of all of these pathways. So if you have a student who's struggling with reading and we don't have the right intervention, those pathways aren't going to build the way that they do in other students. So there's no magic bullet for what we teach. We used to think, oh, this is the best way to work with dyslexia. Well, guess what? There's too much differences. The brain is too complex. It's too different. And a new study that came out in July of 2021 reviewed 24 studies on Orton-Gillingham, which is an excellent decoding program, no doubt about it. But what they said was there's no statistically significant benefit for children with dyslexia. Why? Because when you get a large group of dyslexic children, some may have benefited and others may not have, because there's so much variability. So what do? You try to get it that the iceberg that's below the surface. You want to have interventions. You want to have good, strong curriculum that focuses on decoding, that focuses on comprehension, but you also have to get underneath the iceberg and get at memory, auditory and visual memory and perceptual issues and executive functions and attention. You want to do it all. And this is just an example of one exercise in the program called Fast Forward that I'll be talking about more in the upcoming webinar. But just to show you how one exercise on a computer can work on visual working memory, the ability to control your attention. It's called response inhibition, not just become a happy puncher on the keyboard with your computer, but wait and be patient until a stimulus comes. Track visually and learn to identify sequences of letters and be able to identify sight words all at one time. And I'm just going to briefly show you how one exercise like this, of many that the students do, can get at several different components at the same time. So what you'll see, the penguin says a word, shows it, and then words fly across the page. When the right word comes up, then the student clicks.
1, 4.
And the student has to be patient and wait and track from left to right.
1.
Sometimes the word comes up first. Sometimes the word comes up second. Sometimes the word comes up fourth. And all of that can be done on a computer in a way you can never do it in a classroom. You can also utilize approaches where you're getting at these cognitive skills as well as decoding skills, as well as attentional skills, and actually see the skill accuracies of students and see, okay, this student, this is their strengths, and this student, this is their challenge. And so when I'm working with them individually as a teacher, I'm going to use this approach because that student has that challenge. And does it work? Well, yeah. So we have brain images that were done of normal readers, typical readers. You can see the areas that I've circled that light up, and we saw those on that original slide. But you can see with 35, these are 35 students that are typical readers, 35 students that have dyslexia, and you can see that those areas aren't lighting up. And just to remind you, these are the areas 1, 2, 3, 4 that we see not lighting up over here. and look at what happens after just a few intensive weeks. Now, these students went through about 12 weeks and 8 to 12 weeks, but they were doing 50 minutes a day. If you do 30 minutes a day, it will take a little longer. But notice what happened after just this kind of broad-based approach at working on executive functions and attention and all these other skills, all 4 of those areas that the researchers found were so predictive of reading outcomes have become strengthened. Those students can benefit from classroom instruction. And even in high poverty school districts, what we see is an acceleration of reading skills that goes way beyond the state average. And we see improvement in all subject areas. So I almost did it. We have a few more minutes, about 12 minutes. Well, actually, no, we don't, do we? We have just a couple minutes for questions. Maybe we'll take them online. But Amy, I think you want to talk about follow-up.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Burns. And I apologize to everybody about the delayed chat enablement. I'm glad we figured that out. Thank you so much for your patience. We do have several minutes for questions and answers. So if anybody who is participating today has a question, please go ahead and submit it to the Q&A box. And to kick us off, I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions before we wrap up. The questions that we don't get to, we will have Dr. Burns answer them after the presentation today. So go ahead and submit any questions that you have. One question that we have here for you, Dr. Burns, is do you ever see situations where phonological awareness is so underdeveloped that reading becomes an easier thing than spoken conversation? In this hypothetical scenario, this person would have 0 issues with the ear itself.
That's a really good question. I have had a few children over the years, clients. One little boy had a genesis of the corpus callosum, and he really had trouble with perceiving speech sounds, really struggled. And so his speech, he didn't talk at all till he was 5 years of age. He went through the Fast Forward program and started talking right afterwards, which was really exciting. But as he went through school, one of his strengths was actually reading because he was very good at memorizing words visually. And I've also seen some other individuals with dyslexia who were really good at visual memory, and actually once they got into reading really helped build their auditory skills. So it can, as we saw in that one slide, you can work both ways. Building one skill set often affects the other. Building reading skills can improve perception, but you can also directly work on perception as well to strengthen that in a student.
Thank you. One more quick question, I think, before we'll wrap up is somebody asked to confirm. So you're saying that Orton Gillingham is not effective for dyslexic students?
What I would say based on that research is that it was a big study where they call these mega analyses, and they looked at 24 different studies, and they found that when you average out all the studies, it wasn't effective with dyslexia. But what you have to keep in mind is that it was probably effective when you're doing that, you're looking at averages. So the data showed, well, yeah, it was effective with some of the students and not effective with others. And so where I try to couch this is to say, Orton Gillingham is a great program for students, but for some students, if they don't need intensive work with decoding, another approach might be more effective. And I'll just give you an example of my own daughter who was diagnosed with dyslexia in the 3rd grade. She had years of Orton Gillingham, but became a very slow reader. She would go just email, web, and just became a very slow reader because she was over decoding. And what we had to do is get her into interventions that worked on rapid word recognition so that she didn't over decode. So I think the importance of that research is just to say, look, some students may respond well, but some students may not. And that's why we have to be careful and individualize.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burns. Again, If there are any other questions that we've already received but haven't had a chance to answer, we'll have Dr. Burns respond separately and send that answer out to all of you. If you have any last minute questions, you have like another minute or two for you to submit it to get that in under the wire. To wrap up, I do have a couple. Actually, sorry, before I get to the housekeeping, just wanted to let you know, Dr. Burns, that when you said that, when you asked the poll question earlier about the reasons why we need to look at the beneath the surface parts of the iceberg, everyone across the board answered for all of the above.
Oh yeah, I meant to say that. I meant to mention that. Yeah, great. That's you were listening, and I didn't give you feedback, so my bad.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you. If anybody is interested in learning more about our Fast Forward language and literacy intervention, feel free to explore it on our website here. And if you could go to the next slide, Dr. Burns. If anyone wants to request a certificate of attendance for attending today's webinar, you can absolutely request it. We have a form for that, and let me just go ahead and drop that link into the chat here if you would like to receive it for getting PD credit, of course. And then also, like I mentioned at the top, if you are willing to give us feedback on how today's webinar went, we would love to hear from you. And the QR code here, if you want to grab it on your phone, and I'm also dropping the link in the chat here, is for you to fill out a brief survey about what you thought. We really appreciate it. I look at every single one. So thank you so much in advance. And finally, we have a next webinar that's coming up really soon that Dr. Burns is also going to be presenting.
We don't have that here.
Oh, it's right there, actually, right there. And
this one?
It's
no, this one. Oh, this one, behind the scenes. Yeah.
Yes, it's called Behind the Scenes, where the science of reading meets the brain. And I'm going to drop the link for that again in the chat. If you would like to register, please save your seat. In that webinar, Dr. Burns will be sharing some more cognitive research about reading, science of reading, and how reading impacts the brain and vice versa. And she'll also be digging a little bit more into the research behind how Fast Forward helps struggling readers as well. So looking forward to having you join us on the 27th. So just a little bit over a week from today. I'm seeing a question in the chat. Do we get the PD certificate by filling out the survey? There are actually two separate links. So you can submit a request for a certificate at the one link, and then filling out the survey is separate to give us feedback on what you liked and didn't like about the webinar, so we can continue improving them for future webinars. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. That's our time today. Really appreciate you all joining us. We hope we see you again at a future webinar. Thank you so much, Dr. Burns. Your webinars are always the best. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. QR code is back on the screen. Yes. So again, I'll drop the links one more time into the chat here for to give a survey on the feedback, to request a certificate, and then to register for the upcoming webinar. So those are the three links I just dropped into the chat here. And I hope that's helpful. Thank you again to Dr. Burns. I'm just going to vamp for another minute so people can grab those links if they'd like before I close out the window. We will also send out an email with the recording from today and the slide deck. So keep an eye on your inbox over the next couple of days for you to get that. And it is on, good question. There's a question about when is the upcoming webinar. I believe it is, let me check.
I want to say the 27th.
It is definitely the 27th. And yes, it is at 4:00 Eastern. So we'll be back here and I will know how to turn the chat on at the very beginning of the hour next time. Thank you. Yes, the recording will be available for the upcoming webinar as well. So you just have to register and you'll get the recording if you're not able to make that time. All right. I think I'm gonna close out. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.